I have not knocked over that cactus yet, and I'm really grateful. All right, so this is a famous story of Jesus, one that actually gets repeated in some of the other Gospels. Luke does something a little bit different with it here, though, than, say, in Mark's version. And actually, in Mark's version, the person who was healed gets a name. Bartimaeus, blind Bartimaeus, we may have heard of him. Luke leaves that detail out. For him, that's not the important thing. What's the important thing to Luke is how this whole thing goes down. So Jesus is on his way. He's on his way. First, he's been in Jericho, and now he's going to be quickly heading towards Jerusalem. And we're really getting towards the end of Jesus's ministry out in the world. So he's been out. He's been teaching. He's been preaching for probably about 3 years now. And he's heading towards Jerusalem. And what he has told his disciples will be his kind of final thing with them. And of course, we know from the events of like Holy Week and Easter and Good Friday and all that, what awaits Jesus in Jerusalem. Jesus knows this too, but he's still not hurrying his way there, and he's still taking time along the way to continue the ministry that has been a part of him. It also helps us understand, since he has been doing this for a while, why people are now being attracted to him, because they've heard the stories. Word has traveled about this guy who has this interesting message, about this guy who's teaching, about this guy who's healing people. Jesus' reputation is now going before him, so that when he goes across the road or when he goes into new towns, people already have some understanding of who he is and what he is about. So that is why there is a crowd that starts to follow him everywhere that he goes and comes out and says, let's get a look at this Jesus guy, because we live in a time before television and there's nothing else interesting to do. Right? Again, they don't have the internet. They don't have things. I did appreciate that I think the thing that Carrie Ann probably could have said during her children's messages is take a game so you can do something together instead of staring at your phones while you're waiting for your food to arrive. I might have added that. But they didn't have that. So having a traveling person come by who's going to, any kind of way, would be something interesting to go see. And Jesus definitely was something interesting to go see. So the people came out and the crowds came out to follow after him. Now, it was common also at this time, if you were somebody who had some sort of disability, if you were somebody who was maybe an orphan, if you were somebody who was a widow, if you did not have the means to support yourself, then oftentimes you would, the one last recourse you had was to be on the side of the road and ask for help for those traveling by. This was the most likely place for you to get help, because if people were traveling, oftentimes they had money or something like that with them. So the blind person that isn't named in Luke's version is sitting by the side of the road, and he's basically the equivalent of today somebody standing at the intersection with the cardboard sign. That's who this person is. And so he sees Jesus come, and he's heard the stories, and he knows something about what Jesus does, and he's probably no doubt heard the stories about Jesus' healing and all those sorts of things. So it shouldn't surprise us that when Jesus is there, he starts to cry out. He's like, Jesus, have mercy on me. He knows Jesus is in the healing business, and he is in need of being healed. He knows that. And everybody around him knows that too. And in fact, everybody else who is there in the crowd is there for the same reasons. They've heard about him and they've heard about the miracles. So isn't it interesting then, when he does cry out, when he does seek what he needs, the response of the crowd is not, oh yes, let's see some healing. The response of the crowd is to tell him to shut up. The chorus of the crowd, if you heard that, rebuking him strongly, was to tell him to be quiet, to tell him, please stop bothering Jesus. Jesus has more important things to do than to deal with you. The blind guy thinks maybe, just maybe, that isn't true, and he's willing to do something amazing. The amazing thing he's willing to do, one, absolutely, is to put his faith in Jesus that something might have come of this, that Jesus has the power to heal him. But the other thing that he is able to do, which in my mind is almost equally as amazing, is he's willing to stand up to the crowd. He's willing to stand up to those who are around him, who are telling him to be quiet, telling him he's not that special, telling him he's not worthy of Jesus' attention. Because that's what they're saying. They're saying Jesus has better things to do than to deal with you. And this guy has the courage to stand up and say, I don't think that's true. Now, anybody who's been paying attention to what Jesus has been doing should know all from the beginning that the blind guy is right. Right before this in the story is the story of the rich young ruler who comes to confront Jesus. Not really confront. The rich young ruler comes to talk to Jesus and ask him this very interesting question of what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus' response is, of course, to say, do all these things. And the guy's like, absolutely, I've done all those things. How wonderful for me. And then, of course, Jesus responds, okay, just one more thing. One more little detail for you, rich guy. Sell everything you own and give it to the poor. And of course, the rich young ruler leaves confused. This has just happened. And yet, for some reason, the crowd still doesn't get what Jesus is about and what he's going to do. The truth is, back then is not much different than today. We continue to live in a world that wants to tell us all the time that we're not good enough, that we don't deserve to be blessed. We live in a world all the time that is more than happy to point out our flaws, to point out where we messed up, to tell us all the things that are wrong with us, and that our car isn't new enough, and that our TV isn't new enough, and in fact, billions and billions and billions of dollars of advertising is spent every year to convince us that we don't already have the things we need, and that we would be happier if we would just purchase whatever it is they're trying to sell. We live in a world that's actually far more sophisticated and better at telling us to be quiet, to accept what we have, and if we don't feel good, then to go out and buy some more. Even more so than the blind guy did 2,000 years ago. Now, this comes in different forms, and it doesn't come in the same form, and there usually isn't a crowd standing around us shouting at us, telling us to be quiet. Now, sometimes that happens, occasionally, but oftentimes it comes in a different way. And the challenge for us is to ask ourselves the question, who is right? And how do we overcome those voices around us? Now, there's a lot of great examples of this, and because we're on a road trip and we're supposed to be having fun, I wanted to pick some fun examples of people who are able to kind of live the kind of way that the person from 2,000 years ago was. Now, I'm curious, does anybody remember in the early 90s the show Star Search? Yeah, well, I got an oh yeah over here. All right. So for those of you who don't know, before we had things like The Voice and America's Got Talent and American Idol and all those sorts of shows, there was kind of the originator of all these shows, which of course was Star Search. And Star Search was required viewing in my house growing up, and we watched it a lot. And of course people would come and they would compete with each other, usually in pairs. You'd have two singing groups or two comedians or two magicians or whatever it was, and then a panel would vote on them, and one would become the champion and get to come back, and the other one would go home. And the idea was, and the conceit was, that they were going to go. This happened down in Hollywood, or down in Florida, actually. And the idea was they were going to find like the next stars. Like we were going to find the next stars, and these guys were going to get recording contracts and all that kind of stuff. Now, obviously, what usually happened is somebody came and won Star Search, and you never heard of them again, right? So in 1993, there was a really interesting pairing that happened in the musical category of Star Search. And one of them was this group. It was like 5 guys in a rock band named Skeleton Crew, who of course we've all heard of. We've all got their latest album, right? Yeah, okay. And they were paired off against this young female group at the time called Girls Time. Right? And so the two groups compete, and the judges do their judging. And at the end of the day, Skeleton Crew is the one who won, and they actually do eventually go off and get a record contract, and Girls' Time does not. Now, it would be easy for that, and I think about this moment, especially for these people who I believe like they're in their mid to late teens at this time, this group is, and you got to think that's got to be a hard moment, right? I mean, you're able to get there, and just getting on Star Search is kind of a big deal, but then to get there and lose, right? Some people will argue like the worst thing that can happen in the Olympics is getting the silver medal, right? Like that close to the gold. Right? And they have to, obviously, you kind of wonder what their processing was around this and what they thought they ought to do next. Well, as it happens, this young group of ladies was a little bit more resilient to that. And one of the things they decided to do actually after this was they decided to continue sing and continue to be a group. And they eventually changed the name of their group to something else known as Destiny's Child. And one of those girls, if you don't know Destiny's Child, I guarantee you know one of those girls, at least their name, and of course one of those girls is Beyonce. So if you don't know that Beyonce started her musical career by losing on Star Search, now you know, right? Somehow, in fact, she's given interviews about this, which are really fascinating. Actually, the really interesting interview was the interview that somebody did 20 years later to the band of Wrecking Crew, who have realized that their legacy in music now is to be a footnote in like Beyonce's Wikipedia page, right? Like that is their thing. They did actually get a record deal, but they all fell apart and it didn't really work out well for them. But they're like, hey, man, if you can hook your star to something, you might as well hook your star to Beyonce. There are worse things. So this is one example. Now, another example so this happened in 1993. Another example actually happened 20 years before this, and it happened in Maine, at a school in Maine. Now, I don't know if you know this, Maine is apparently a state. I've never been there. It's one of those things that just seems so impossibly far away. But one thing I do know and have been told about Mainers is that Mainers are kind of their own thing. Right? They're kind of up there, right up against Canada, all by their lonesome. And so they can be a little odd. So in 1973, there was a math teacher there who himself was a little bit odd and was a little bit bored being a math teacher and decided what he really wanted to do is be a writer. So in his off time and over the summers and stuff, he wrote a book, and he wrote a really long book, a book longer than most people write, and it's full of a lot of details that most people don't include. He's a very verbose guy, and it was actually a bit of a scary book. It was not a book that you would want to read at night before going to bed, that kind of thing. And he wanted to get this book published, and so he submitted it to over 30 people. Now, this is 1973, so submitting it means actually making a copy at great expense because copies were not 3 cents a piece at Kinko's at this time, right? So making a bunch of copies, mailing them off, and then waiting for mailed responses back. So over the course of a summer, you have to recognize this guy got 30 letters in the mail that said, thanks, but no thanks. We don't think there's a market for this book. Now, the book was Carrie, and the guy was Stephen King, who is now one of the most published, prolific, and successful authors of all time. But in order to get there, he had to listen to a crowd of 30 knowledgeable people in the publishing industry tell him he wasn't good enough. And he was about to give up, actually until his wife encouraged him to do something else. One last quick one. 10 years even before this, in 1962, Decca Records decided to sign this little group of 4 people that nobody had ever heard of, recorded 15 songs on their behalf, listened to their songs, and the executives basically said, we don't like their sound, and guitar music is on the way out. They have no future in show business. That band was, of course, the Beatles. You're like, whoever that executive at Decca Records was, my gosh, I'm guessing he lost his job. The world will find ways when we want to step out, when we want to ask, when we think there's something we are called to do or need to do. We should not be surprised that we live in a world that will often try to tell us why we can't or shouldn't do that. Even us sitting here today in this church as part of the Methodist tradition get to be part of this tradition because John Wesley was able to overcome those same voices. John Wesley came back from a really terrible, failed attempt to be a missionary in America, where he had to leave in the cover of darkness, came back to his home in England and had to figure out what to do with himself. Nobody wanted him in their churches. He was an ordained pastor, but he didn't have a parish because none of the churches wanted him, because at the time he was considered to be pretty much damaged goods. And so he started a group that he called the Holy Club, that other people later called, in a term of derision, Methodists. And John Wesley went to preach and guest preach at various places. And even though he was a good preacher and he was a good speaker, the message that he brought and the good news that he wanted to bring was not welcomed by very many people. And in fact, one author writing about Methodist history talks about Methodists of this time and says they were denounced as promulgators. Promulgators. I don't know if I've ever promulgated anything. You're a I'm like, what does it mean? I like that word. They were denounced as promulgators of strange doctrine, fomenters of religious disturbances, as blind fanatics, leading people astray, claiming miraculous gifts, attacking the clergy of the Church in England, and trying to reestablish Catholicism. That was when John Wesley went from place to place, it was not uncommon for him to be run out of town afterwards. And in fact, I think I've shared this before, John Wesley would not preach inside unless there was a back door that he could flee from. There's a great note in one of his journals where he talks about, I went, and so this is one of the reasons why John Wesley eventually ends up preaching outdoors and in the fields, because it was easier to find escape routes after he was done. And there was actually there's a couple sections in his journal where he very nonchalantly mentions, hey, I preached in this field today, and then somebody turned all the cows loose on us, so then I left. As I shared last week, I sometimes wonder how you all are going to respond to what I say. Nothing compared to John Wesley. John Wesley got himself in trouble because he wanted to bring a good news message to a group of people that the church was ignoring. He recognized that there was a group, especially the working class, those who were doing the hard jobs in the mines and the hard jobs in the kitchens and all these other work, were being left out of the good news that was being proclaimed amongst the proper people in the churches. John Wesley wanted to bring the good news to those folks not because he didn't want the good news shared with the others by any means, but he had this radical idea that the good news is actually meant to be shared by all. That the blessings that Jesus came to give us, the hope that Jesus came to give us, the peace that Jesus came to give us is meant to be shared by everybody, the important people who get to stand in the front of the crowds, and the less important people who always seem to find themselves in the back. John Wesley believed what Jesus believed, which is all those folks are worthy. So we should not be surprised that John Wesley went out into the world and did what he did, that he violated customs and boundaries of the day, and even though he got shouted down by many a crowd, continued on because he believed as Jesus did. That Jesus came with a message, and that message was from everybody. I sometimes wonder if that blind guy heard what Jesus did at the beginning of his ministry, and the crowd somehow missed it. Because obviously the crowd that was shouting down the poor amongst them didn't hear what Jesus said all the way back at the beginning. Because when Jesus began his ministry here on earth, when Jesus began his ministry amongst those people, all the way back in Luke chapter 4, he quoted a specific passage in the synagogue, and many people heard him do it. And of course, that passage came from Isaiah. And Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free." Jesus was incredibly clear what he was about, and incredibly clear what he was supposed to be doing. The blind guy knew that. For some reason, the crowd did not. As I said, we live in a world that will oftentimes to shut us down or put us in a box or try to tell us why we're not that special, why we're not that important. God comes with a different message. God comes with a good news message that's for all of us. that says we're all God's beloved children, that we're all important to God, that God is seeking to bless each and every one of us, and that we should all, whenever we are in need, feel free to take those cares and concerns to Christ. Because if Jesus will make room on that crowded day along the road when he's got somewhere to get to, when Jesus will make room in that time, in that place for that person, certainly Jesus will make room for us. So we should not be afraid to lift our prayers and our concerns up to God, and we should be assured that God is listening. We may not always get the answer we want. That's not the promise. But the promise is that we will be heard, and that we are loved, and that we are in God's care. That is the good news. That is the good news we celebrate here as Methodists and as followers of Christ. And it's been the good news from the very beginning. Amen.